De-dollarization is discussed more and more these days, especially since the conflict in Ukraine broke out. But this process has been ongoing for quite some time, especially when it comes to sanctioned hit countries like Iran, Russia, and China in particular. Well, the Russian president has said that de-dollarization of the world economy is inevitable. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at how feasible this approach is and whether there really is a chance for world countries to be freed from the dollar's political arm, specifically one in which the U.S. has used as a weapon. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Political analyst and journalist at the Convo Couch, Fiorella Isabel, joins us from Moscow. Also joining us is former CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who joins us from Raleigh. I'd like to welcome to you both. Let's take a look first and put our attention to you, Fiorella Isabel, and what the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said, that the process of de-dollarization of the global economy is inevitable. The question comes about, we've heard that before, and at this point, what about the when of this process, and how can we see that happen in layman terms, if you can?
Right. So what we're seeing is the collapse of the EU. We're seeing the collapse of the euro. We're seeing these sanctions that have consequences more on those who are imposing them than on Russia. These sanctions have essentially destroyed the European economy. And the United States, of course, doesn't seem to care very much about that. The United States defense industry and the elite of the United States are fine, but their own country is lacking in infrastructure, and in a lot of just domestic issues are coming to a really huge issue. So Russia has other markets that they're looking at. They're looking at China, they're looking at India, they're looking at Pakistan. They're getting closer with an economic relationship to Latin America, closer to African nations as well. And so what we're seeing is this shift towards a multipolar world where the United States no longer calls the shots, where the West no longer calls the shots. And so the sanctions are actually not hurting Russia as intended. In fact, Russia has been able to bounce back rather quickly. The economy, the ruble, has been extremely high. I think the highest that any other currency has in terms of the bounce back. And the right now with the coming winter, we're seeing that Russia will be fine when it comes to gas, when it comes to, in spite of some inflation, Russia's energy is secure. Whereas if you compare that to the EU and the UK, there's a completely different situation going on. And I think that's where we're headed.
Well, a top economic advisor to the Russian President Vladimir Putin, Ray McGovern, has said that aside from China and Russia avoiding using the dollar, is that it will minimize Washington's ability to bully other countries into following, I guess, the U.S. rules or the Western rules. And they have done that with the threat of sanctions, obviously. Do you think that that will happen? Ray McGovern?
Oh, you expect me. Well, I think it's inevitable, not in the short run, but over the longer term. What we have is a situation where the Ukraine war and the economic sanctions have caused a tectonic shift in what the world looked like just a year ago. We have the lily-white West on the one hand, and then we have everybody else, mostly people of color, on the other hand. China, India, Russia has been so blackened that it's become a people of color. The list goes on. So you have a small minority that used to dominate things no longer able to do that. And I think as winter comes on and the Europeans realize that, you know, following U.S. diktat like lemmings can get us into a lot of trouble and even can make us freeze to death. So there's time before the winter's onslaught to work out a sensible arrangement where, in addition to lifting some of these stupid sanctions that were never going to work, in response to that, allowing the Europeans to get through the winter with enough natural gas and oil so that they can deal with this stuff once spring comes. Now, the thing in the war in Ukraine, of course, is very crucial to this. But no reputable military analyst, and I used to be one of them in my day when I served as an Army intelligence officer. No responsible person will predict that Ukraine will win this war. What's in store is protracted grief for both sides, as long as NATO goads the Ukrainians on. And as my co-guest just said, the U.S. doesn't seem to care much about that, nor does the U.S. seem to care much about being warm during the wintertime.
Sure.
Nor does the West seem to care about the possibility of a new Chernobyl right there in Zaporozhye in the middle of Ukraine. Don't the Western politicians realize what that could mean? And how the U.S. will accept that blithely, with Victoria Nuland in Kiev saying,
Indeed.
Yeah, well, keep shelling Zaporozhye.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned there, Fiorella Isabel, is about Russian energy resources, in particular, obviously, gas and oil being at the top of that list. Now, here's what's interesting about how Ray McGovern says the West doesn't seem to realize or doesn't seem to care, I think is how he worded that. Why doesn't the West care when you look at the countries like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and China, where cumulatively we're talking about 40% of the world's energy in the hands of these countries? Shouldn't the U.S. and the West care about how this divergence from the dollar, or de-dollarization, as we have stated, were these countries, which they are moving away from it, would affect the standing of the dollar and hence all the repercussions from that in terms of how it would impact the U.S. economy? Don't they realize that that's what's going to happen?
Well, so there's a couple of things here. That's been the talk. Why does the United States and the West not seem to care? I think Germans seem to care, right? They're out there protesting. People in the Czech Republic have been protesting against NATO and against these sanctions on Russia because they know it's hurting their economy. I think that the working people care, but the people in power are in some ways benefiting from this. The U.S. defense industry has skyrocketed. They're making a literal killing of this. And so the United States seems to be bullying the EU into imposing these sanctions on Russia to their own detriment, essentially. And so what's been the talk lately is came from this report from Rand Corporation that basically outlined that the United States was pushing to destroy the German economy, because let's remember that Germany is extremely vulnerable to these sanctions because they depend largely on cheap gas from Russia. And so this is a suicidal mission for Germany. And in that report, it basically said, well, in order to continue this sort of political ploy, then Germany would have to impose sanctions on Russia. And of course, it will sink its economy. And then to a greater extent, it will affect the economy of the EU. But this is a way to eliminate one of its competitors. Now, it's interesting because Germany and nations in the EU, particularly obviously the NATO nations, are huge allies of the West. So it seems to me, and this is what so many are analyzing right now, is that this is a sort of controlled demolition of the economy to achieve a political purpose, and they do not care because the people pushing this sort of thing are still making out with a lot of money. So
Indeed.
That's essentially what's being talked about right now, because otherwise it doesn't really make any logical sense that they would be pushing this to their own detriment.
Well, we need to talk about this a little bit more, even though it may be going off the subject somewhat, Ray McGovern, but to expand more about what our guest there, Fiorella Isabel, said. I'm looking at a headline of which it should really open the eyes of many, and that's how energy traders are making a killing exporting U.S. natural gas. $200 million for each single shipment, of which basically the sale of U.S. gas, liquefied natural gas, has gone up to 60%, increased that is to 60% up from less than 20% this time a year ago. So we can see that being one of the few ways that the U.S. is profiting from this war. It seems like the U.S. is actually after this particular way of profiting off the war. The gas issue, energy, and of course the military sales.
Well, I appreciate Fiorella's analysis of this, and she could well be right. What I have to hearken back to is what I call the recklessness and the fecklessness of our foreign policy leaders. Now, I refer specifically to Blinken and his counterpart in Germany, Baerbock. They don't seem to know which end is up. They are very poorly advising the German government and the German people. And, you know, it seems to me that this, where money is always important, whether the U.S. is doing this deliberately and Baerbock is just too dumb to realize it, to tank the German economy, that presumes an imagination and a competence that I don't think exists in Washington or with Baerbock. Now, when I said before, I hope I didn't say the West doesn't care much about the effects of the sanctions. I tried to say the U.S. doesn't, because we're kind of immune. We're going to be warm this winter. And if the new Chernobyl, if Zaporozhye blows because of shelling by the Ukrainians, the U.S. will be sitting pretty. There'll be a big problem in Europe, not just in Ukraine, but this helps me to understand why someone like Victoria Nuland, the Deputy Secretary of State, can go to Kiev, chutzpah personified. She's the one that caused the coup in Kiev on February 22nd, 2014. She goes back to Kiev, and next thing you know, we have a very big offensive, and they're still shelling Zaporozhye. UN comes in, and this is a teaching point here. Can you depend on the UN? I'm sorry, you can't depend on the IAEA. Rafael Grossi goes down there, and the shelling comes in, and he can't figure out which direction it's coming from. Give me a break. He says, we can't judge which direction it's coming from. We thank the Russians for protecting us from these projectiles, but we have to do something about this, but we don't know who's doing the shelling. Come on, give me a break. Now, my point is simply this. It used to be we could depend on the IAEA. Back 20 years ago, when Bush and Cheney wanted to make war on Iraq, I remember El Baradei, the head of the IAEA, saying very solemnly before the UN Security Council, the reports of these yellow cake uranium from Africa are not confirmed, are not, what was the word he used? Not authentic. In other words, they were made up. So since El Baradei retired, there have been a succession of people in charge of the IAEA who passed muster in Washington. Amano is another one, his direct successor. Sure. He have the cable in which he thanked the Americans for putting him in office, and he asked for new money to put new drapes in his office. That's so bad. We got that from WikiLeaks. So the problem is, where can the Russians turn to get a fair reading on what's going on at this critical place, the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe? They can't turn anywhere to get an unvarnished view of from which direction the shelling is coming.
Well, to go back to what we were talking about, the whole notion of de-dollarization here, basically, Fiorella Isabel, what we are looking at to have really speeded this up, in the context of the Ukraine conflict, is when the U.S. and the West in particular, or cumulatively, froze Russia's roughly $640 billion of their assets in the foreign currency reserves due to the U.S. sanctions. That made countries around the world basically wake up. It was a wake-up call, because they said, well, if we don't follow U.S. foreign policy, we could be next. Do you think then, and we have Saudi Arabia that actually began thinking about selling its oil based on the yuan. Israel, even for the first time, added China's yuan to its currency in a reshuffle that's not happened in a decade. So are we looking at countries then de-dollarizing because of that, and therefore the dollar to take a hit from it?
I think the dollar is already taking a hit in those terms, right? I don't think I agree with Ray McGovern. I don't think it's going to happen right away. I think it's on its way to happening. I think it will allow for a more level playing field. And the reason I think these countries are doing that is because less of an ideological reason. I think for the most part, it's more of where they see the wind blowing, right? Like there is an economic shift right now that like never before. And Russia standing up to the expansion of NATO and Russia bouncing back and being extremely just resilient with how they've done this, with the exit of say like these corporations like Starbucks, McDonald's. They've reinvented these sort of corporations into a Russian-based type of company where people can still keep their jobs. And that sort of resilience has resonated with many people who have found that, hey, we have all been under the boot of the US empire. So now we have these opportunities to maybe perhaps build our relationships with areas that we really haven't been looking at, which is why you've been seeing, Russia go in there. You saw Lavrov be received with open arms in Africa, where, of course, they talked about the USSR helping to decolonize several of these nations, whereas Blinken was not received that warmly at all. And then, of course, you see the United States poking the dragon with China as well, and via Taiwan with Pelosi's visit. So you see this sort of the economics is following, or I should say, like the actions of militarily of the United States, NATO, and the West are and Russia closer together, are pushing Iran closer to that relationship, are pushing African nations closer to dealing with their neighbors in the East, and Latin America, of course. They're pushing all these nations together that have one thing in common, and that is the years and decades of being under the U.S. hegemony, right? And so they're looking for ways to no longer go back to that. And it's, again, more economic based than ideological. So I do think we're heading in that direction where the dollar will no longer be but I think that's going to be more so on China rather than Russia. I do think that, like I said, it's going to be multiple choices. And of course, Russia is looking to the East, they're looking to Africa. They don't necessarily United States anymore. And they're making that very clear by refusing these price caps on the gas, right? And saying,
Sure.
We're not going to do that at all.
Well, we're going to talk about other countries, in particular China, in the context of BRICS. But before we get to that, because our guest Ray McGovern there is in the U.S., Ray McGovern, economically and somewhat technically speaking, the dollar crisis scenario, based on the definition of it, is said that what would cause a sudden crisis for the dollar is when there's the dual threat of high inflation and high debt. Now, the U.S. is plagued by those two factors, isn't it? If I'm incorrect, please let me know. That's a scenario where rising consumer prices force the Fed to raise the interest rates, something that it has done. Are we looking at these two, the debt and the inflation, causing the crisis, or has it done it already?
Well, it's on its way. It's well on its way. The question is whether policymakers in Washington have been so infected with this notion that the U.S. is exceptional that it continued to act the way it has been acting. That's what I call feckless. It's also very reckless, because if they don't realize which end is up here, people trading in rubles now, and it's inevitable what's going to happen with the debt as it is, and the balance of payments and everything else. The economic situation is awful. The military situation, however, is something that will have an effect on all this. And when President Putin and President Xi meet in Samarkand just 2 days from now, there will be very important decisions made as to how much support President Xi is willing to give to Putin as Putin reacts to the recent reversals in Ukraine. I fear the worst. I fear escalation untrammeled. And one of the big factors, of course, is that Biden cannot appear to be weak as the midterm elections grow near, and that's just 2 months from now.
Okay, yeah, indeed. We'll be looking forward to that meeting. So coming down to the wire here in terms of our time, looking at what you said, Fiorella Isabel, about China, I'd like to put that into the context of this BRICS summit that took place, the 14th one, where there was an announcement made by the Russian President Vladimir Putin about the intention to develop a new international reserve currency. Now that's something that obviously the BRICS countries have entertained, and Brazil actually took it a step further in a sense in its part of the world, where with the presidential candidate at this point, Luis Ignacio da Silva, to have announced a regional currency for those countries there. This idea of regional currency and to trade with currencies that is not the dollar, is that going to further push the whole de-dollarization notion into high gear?
Yeah, so what we're seeing particularly with BRICS countries, right, are once again countries that have been very in a situation where they've been completely vulnerable and completely dependent in some ways on the West. And there is a push, as you can see, based on the recent elections that have been happening in Latin America, towards a sovereignty, towards exerting their own sovereignty away from the West, recuperating some of the identity. We saw this with the election of Gustavo Petro in Colombia. We've seen this obviously in Bolivia. We've seen this in Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba. A lot of these countries are huge allies, including Venezuela, of course, with Russia and also Iran. And so what we're seeing is this push in these BRICS countries, and these countries that want to be a part of BRICS as well, that they want to have their own dependency, and they want to expand not just with China and Russia, but with their own neighbors. In Latin America, there's like a reemergence of the Bolivarian sentiment from Simón Bolívar, where you know there was this talk of liberation and democracy. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that definitely is playing a role ideologically, but also economically. It's a lot easier to make connections with your neighbors, and also, of course, when China offers a more equitable economic relationship, they're going to take it.
Thank you so much for that. We're fresh out of time. Fiorella Isabel, political analyst and journalist at the Convo Couch. Thank you. Former CIA analyst Ray McGovern. Thank you so much from Raleigh. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mika Vatahwe and the team, it's goodbye until next time.